Hello everyone! I recently found this Elsa doll at the thrift store and she has really good articulation in, well, everywhere but her knees. So I figured why not replace her legs with a tail and make her a mermaid. And I was having a hyperfixation on Subnautica recently, so I figured why not make a Leviathan. But I couldn't choose, so I spun a wheel and got the Chelicerate. I'm first gonna make a quick painting. I've got these tiny little canvases. Here's just like a ruler for scale. And I'm just gonna paint it first with no commentary. Enjoy that. Now that the painting is done, I can start on the actual doll. This doll is quite a bit different from the Monster High and Ever After High dolls I usually work on. For one, the lower part of her legs and her arms are very rubbery, and her lower legs in particular are very flexible, although that doesn't really matter too much as I'm going to be removing them. First, I start off by cutting her hair very short at the base of her head. Once all of her hair was off, I then took her head off in hopes that I would still be able to get the rest of the plugs out through her neck. I was actually not. My pliers were too big, and even using tweezers was too big, so I had to cut a hole in the back of her head to get the rest of the plugs out. I actually ended up having to cut a bigger hole into her scalp, so I glue the outer piece on and then the inner piece. I set that aside to dry and focus on removing her legs. These were actually easier to remove than the last mermaid doll I did, probably because it was made of a cheaper plastic. After a while of trying to brute force it, I took an X-Acto knife to the joints on the inside, and that got the job done. Once I got the legs off, I set them aside. Don't quite know what I'm going to do with some spare legs. Then I realized I need to take the pelvis off of her so I can have sort of a concave structure, because her tail is going to be segmented like a Chelicerate's. So I get that taken off with my dad's Dremel tool. He actually did this part. And I also had him sand off her chest, because I still think that mermaids are fish and do not have boobs. I then just put some clay over the chest area to smooth it out and get rid of the holes. Then I go around the bottom of the body to cover up the raw plastic edge. This next part I had never done before. I took a sewing needle and heated it up over a candle and just stabbed it through her body. This is going to be the anchor that will connect the tail onto her body. I was actually following Enchantarium's way of doing it from their Dark Lila video. Then I paint over her torso with white just as a quick base coat. To make her tail, I made little pinch pots out of clay. This was the first thing I made. It's literally just a bowl. This is the second. It has a hole in the middle, but it's too small to be the first joint. So I make one a bit bigger, and I will show you the process of making these. Basically just roll it up into a ball, and since this is air dry clay, I drown the heck out of this piece of clay. And once I got it into a little ball, I make sure it fits into the next joint, and I poke a hole through it, then pinch the sides out, hence the name pinch pot. The Chelicerate has 10 segments of the tail. This is not including the actual end tail piece or the head. I get those all made, and they take several days to dry, so I gotta wait for that part. For the end tail piece, I use an armature wire for a skeleton. This is because I want it to be very strong, and also to make the loop that will be going through all the other tail pieces. I make sure the loop is just big enough so that it fits snug into the next joint that's right ahead of it, then go ahead and cut it short. Several of the tail pieces need to have spikes, so I poke a hole through the top pieces once they're all dry and put some armature wire in there, then secure it on the inside with hot glue, and I also secure it on the outside with an extra bit of clay on the bottom. Now that they're all dry, I can finally start painting them. The bottom of the Chelicerate's tail is white, so I do that first. This takes a few coats since the clay I'm using is red. I also make sure to keep up with the process on the end tail piece, since it's going to be treated no differently from every other piece. Once those few coats are dry, I go over the rest of it with a few coats of red, which is just barely in frame. So yeah, this is great. I also paint that spike armature wire red as well. On the edges of each piece, there is a little white ring, so I dry brush on white onto each piece. And if you don't know what dry brushing is, it's just when you take the tiniest amount of paint on your paintbrush and kind of dust it on. It's usually used for highlighting or making shadows in places, but in this case, it's an integral part of the color. I check back at a reference image and realize that the smooth white line I made is, well, too smooth. So I take a dotting tool and make a bunch of little white dots along the edges to make it more rough and natural. I then color some plastic blue and stick it on for the blue fin that's on the top of the spines. I'm aware that technically it's supposed to connect to the preceding piece of tail, but I wouldn't be able to do that without also compromising the posability of the tail, and also it would break off more easily. I hot glue the plastic on and cover it up with some blue paint, kind of feathering it out over the film. I also almost forgot the tiny little blue tail piece that's on one of the end tail pieces, but I soon remember it. I glue a small stripe of felt on the inside of each tailpiece. This is so that the paint on the piece before it doesn't chip off, as I know it will if I don't cover it up, even with me sealing it in. It happens with joints like shoulders and elbows, and also knees on an average doll, so it would happen here if I didn't cover it up with felt. I make sure all the tail pieces can still fit together, and the tail is done. Now I can focus on the face, which I kind of bulk up the eyes a bit more, make the smile downturned, and add an extra eye that the Chelicerate has. I kind of bulge out the eyes a bit more to make them look more fish-like, though I don't quite think I achieved this, and probably won't do it on future Leviathans, if I ever do make some in the future, which I do want to. As you can probably see, even though it's just barely in frame, I kind of carve out where the eye is going to go. I promise you will not be able to see this later. This is just a guide for me so that I don't make the eyes all wonky later. I was sort of debating with myself about what to do with the giant mandibles on its face, so I kind of downsized them and just stuck them right on over the mouth. I can finally start painting this doll. I first put down a base coat of white just so that everything is one uniform color. Then I mixed up a red color and go to town painting that and the body also. I go ahead and paint the mandibles and eyes black, but I leave a white ring around the eyes so that I can add the dark purple. The purple I'm using is actually so dark that you can barely see it. I add white dots on the inside of her first eye, like the ones straight on the front of her head, and then I put a black spot on the inside of those so that they'll look like a white ring. It's much easier than just trying to paint a ring at this scale. I expand the black circles until the white ring is very thin. Then I go around her eyes, both sets of eyes, with a white outline. I usually use black, but in the Chelicerate's case, it's white. I also put this white outline around the mandibles, just to make them stand out more. Then I dry brush on a lighter gray color to give them more detail or dimension. I was figuring that her face looked a bit empty, so I asked my partner on what I could do. They sent me this, and personally I really like it, so I paint that onto her face. It looks good, but painting all the thin white lines onto her face was kind of a pain in the butt, so I don't want to do it again. At that, her face is done, so I can focus on the body, which there isn't really much to do other than paint it to look more like the tail pieces. I go over it with red, then go over her front with a layer of white. In hindsight, I probably shouldn't have painted it red first. I also paint a white stripe around the bottom of the torso and dry brush up her back. I use more blue plastic for the fins on her arms and do the same thing that I did with the tail pieces, hot gluing it on, then just covering it up with some blue paint. It's at this point that I put her head back on, which I probably should have done earlier because I was really scared that I was going to crack something or that something would fall off, but it made it on with no problem. Now that everything is sculpted and painted, I can finally put it all together. I was so excited while stringing the tail pieces together. I'm using elastic, by the way. I was very excited to see how it all looked together. Once all the pieces are on, I make sure there's enough to get it back all the way through and thread it through the last tail piece's hook, and then up through all the pieces once again. I secured a pin onto it to make it a bit easier to pull it through. I tie a knot on the end to make a loop and use pliers to make it reach up through the body so I can hook it onto the broken needle that I was using to put a hole through the torso originally. I don't show this part on camera because it would have been really hard to show it and be able to see at the same time. Then I just cut the excess off. This actually took a lot more effort than I would have expected. Sewing needles are very strong, as it turns out. She still needs hair, and so I take a quick picture of her so that I can draw some different hair colors and styles on her. At first, I got these three colors going with the same color palette, then with different stripes going through them, and then in different hairstyles, before finally settling on these two. With two hairstyles in mind, I set out to making a couple of wig caps. This was when I thought I was going to be using yarn wefts, and if you don't know, at least in my case, my yarn wefts are too short to be able to be pulled into a really nice looking ponytail if I just make it down. So I made a couple wig caps, which was a waste of time, but you know, at least it's good practice. So I made them out of fabric that I put about 5 layers of glue over. I probably should have added more because in hindsight these kinda sucked. They didn't even make it around the full head. But yeah, I did end up throwing them out because instead I was using yarn that was just pulled apart like this, because I thought, well, ocean water makes your hair wavy and kind of a mess, so it only makes sense that a mermaid's hair would be like that too. Since I didn't make it into a wefts, I picked them up in strands of about 3 or 4 and glue them onto the head. I'm going with mostly white with some red stripes thrown in there, and I definitely pulled apart too many of the yarn strands because I did think I was going to be making 2 different heads of hair for the wig caps. I continue going in a circle around her whole head, just like this, alternating between having stripes and no stripes. Then I just add more stripes because I wanted it to be visible under all her hair. Once I got it all on, and it's finally dry, I can flip the hair back from out of her face. And then it's done, mostly. I just need to cut it down to size because it's taking up most of her length. I tie it in a ponytail and then start cutting. I want it to be nice and long, but I also want the spikes on her tail to be visible and not, hidden by all of her hair. So I just take my scissors and start hacking away. Which, by the way, I should say, do not do this to your own hair. It's a really bad idea. This is yarn hair, so even though it doesn't grow back, I can stick more on. I eventually tear out of the ponytail to see how good the length looks. I cut it down a bit more, and I personally think it looks pretty good. Up until now, I've been debating on her face, thinking it looks a bit strange, not just in she's a Chelicerate strange, but she has no eyebrows strange. So I give her some eyebrows, and I think it makes her face look a lot better. She's basically done at this point, but the paint on her elbows and her shoulders have been chipping off this whole time, and no matter what I do, it doesn't stay on, so I need a way to cover it up. I figure I could make her a piece of clothing, like a shawl or something, and I wanted it to kind of be based on plants from the game. I originally think creepvine, but then make a bigger list because I think it would be too obvious to do creepvine, and I have to eliminate these plants one by one. This one's just a root. These are too hard to get to for a Chelicerate. This is too far and also too small. This one canonically dies if it doesn't have nutrients. I originally thought this was good, but then I read the wiki entry, and yeah, no. Then it's just these two, and I go with the creepvine, because I thought it would go good with our warm color palette. So I get some orange yarn because the creepvine stem is orange and start finger knitting the shawl because it would be nice and loose that way. Also, if you're wondering why I went through all the work of researching all those plants just to go with the one that I originally thought of, well, I didn't think that I would go with the one that I originally thought of, so I wasted a good few hours. Yay! Since this is doll-sized, it doesn't take too long to knit, and I soon have a full thing that I have to make sure fits the actual doll, and then I sew some snaps into the yarn, which is honestly easier said than done, but I manage. Then I use hot glue to make little beads in the yarn. These beads are going to be creepvine seed clusters, which my partner actually suggested, and I thought it was a really good idea. I wanted to find some red glow-in-the-dark paint, but any paint that did glow-in-the-dark glowed green, so I couldn't use any for this, which sucks, but I can move on. Then I used some felt and cut out a bunch of triangles for the leaves. After I cut them out, I round off the corners and paint an orange gradient. This was all the ones that I cut out to begin with. Spoiler alert, it was not enough and I needed to make more. But anyway, I proceed on to painting, which didn't take too long for each individual leaf, which, phew. And instead of sewing them on through yarn, I'm going to hot glue them all on. I get most of the way done before I need to cut out some more leaves, so cut out more leaves I do, glue them right on, and then she's done. I hope you guys enjoyed the video and maybe want to see some more Leviathans made into mermaids. See ya!